Is Christianity a myth? No, say most sincere Christians. Yes, say most atheists. And, perhaps surprisingly, yes, said C.S. Lewis, one of the most prominent and sophisticated Christian thinkers of the 20th century. The realization of Christianity as a myth is usually considered a stepping stone in atheist or agnostic coming-of-age stories. According to these well-trodden accounts, a fragile and groundless childhood faith is shattered on the rough path into adulthood. Baseless convictions about the supernatural are dashed on the unsympathetic rocks of rationality. The so-called myth of the Sunday school stories gives way to a pragmatic and scientific rationalism. All of which makes the issue sound very neatly tied up. However, if something looks like an oversimplification and sounds like an oversimplification, it's quite possible that it is, in fact, an oversimplification. C.S. Lewis' own life story turns this familiar Christianity as myth story on its head. For to Lewis, coming to sense mythic elements in Christianity was not a crucial staging post on the way out of belief. Rather, this realization was a key waypoint on the way into a life of faith. What's more, for Lewis, this was not faith as blind hope or faith in fairy tales. This was an intellectually fulfilled and reasonable conviction in the rational and the imaginative meaningfulness of what the Bible says about God, the universe, and everything. The sensing of mythic elements within the Bible was a kind of litmus indicator that Christianity had something profound to say about the human condition. And led through this door, the once godless Lewis would eventually arrive at an affirmation of the biblical view of reality, the objective historicity of the Gospels, and the weighty significance of the physical death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. C.S. Lewis was better qualified than most to grasp the significance of myth in understanding the human condition. As a first-rate classical scholar, he had a deep acquaintance with the mythic traditions of world literature. The tales of such figures as Odysseus, Osiris and Balder were well-worn paths in the wide expanses of his mind. But despite his intellectual prowess, Lewis was not simply academic in this appreciation of mythic forms. On the contrary, he was a lifelong connoisseur of its primary imaginative appeal, not as a detached critic, but as passionate devotee. This was an imaginative heritage tracing back to the earliest annals of his memory. Lewis' childhood had been frequently punctuated by vivid pangs of joy when he contemplated mythic themes and settings. As an adult, he would come to apply his considerable intellect to analysing these insights, but a childhood remembrance of the elemental power of myths on the imagination never left him. So we see that as both a sharp scholar and a sensitive lover of myths, Lewis was better placed than almost anyone else to know the contours and significance of the form. Yet, as a young man, Lewis had also known what it was to affirm a scientistic, rationalistic view of the world. As a person with intellectual aspirations, he had felt obliged to affirm the brand of glib scientism that was de rigueur in his modernist age. But all the while Lewis wrestled with an apparently forbidden world of imaginative power trying to push through in his consciousness. Though a self-professed skeptic throughout his formative years, Lewis had never been able to deny the luminous power and inexorable draw of the mythic. But even so, it appeared impossible to reconcile this so-called beautiful lie with the apparently absolute authority of science over all claims to meaning and truth. An unhappy Lewis had felt resigned to consider myths as lies breathed through silver, beautiful indeed, but nonetheless deceitful. This apparently irreconcilable breach between subjective and objective meaning became a source of considerable existential angst for the young Lewis. His inner life was fragmented, pressured on one side by the luminous power of myths he felt compelled to reject, and on the other by the drabness of a rationalism he felt obliged by reason to affirm. As he wrote, looking back on his early adulthood, "The two hemispheres of my mind were in the sharpest contrast. On the one side a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth, on the other a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved I believed to be imaginary, Nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. But Lewis was no ideologue. Unlike many of his peers at Oxford, he was not willfully committed to rationalistic presuppositions against all contrary evidence. Rather, he had the common sense to entertain his strong intuition that a form as powerful as the mythic might just contain a spark of something true. However unscientific it might turn out to be, perhaps myths did indeed possess some kind of correspondence to reality that explained their evident imaginative power. It is to this correspondence that we now turn. It's important to realise how burdened the term myth has become in our present age. As we encounter the question, what is myth? We are far from neutral ground. For myth has become a lazy catchword for a made-up story, a fairy tale, something appealing perhaps, but lacking almost by definition anything we might call truth. Yet, though myths are generally expressed through fictitious characters and scenarios, this does not appear to prevent them from resonating with the energy of something real. If nothing else impresses us about the mythic form, it's remarkable how persistent it is across time and place, across people groups and languages. It's striking how often similar themes have recurred across the mythologies of different cultures. There is a kind of universality at play, a universality pointing to a deep connection between the mythic form and the human condition. Myths seem to mine something, shared by otherwise diverse people, separated by vast distances of time and place. They seem to mine some shared seam of raw material we intuitively sense within our existential situations, without needing to be taught how. Yet if myths touch truth, they seem to do so by an indirect route. We generally equate truth with evidence and argument, with the exercise of reason. But myths skirt round the rational faculties to drop their payloads directly on the imagination. They come to us clothed in fictitious characters. They show rather than tell. This primary appeal of myth to imagination rather than reason probably accounts for much of the caricature of myths as made-up stories, for that assertion that they have little relevance to the real world. It was David Hume who famously said we should consign to the flames any truth claim lacking either abstract reasoning concerning number or experimental reasoning concerning matters of fact. Of course, this kind of attitude wipes out any hope of truth or meaning residing in the mythic, and indeed in art as a whole. It's a stance which, once taken, leaves us with only the hard sciences, if even these, as conduits of truth. But it also presents a false choice, for we simply do not know how to rationally ground either imagination or reason as correct ways of grasping truth or meaning. After all, to place trust in either reason or imagination is to take a form of pre-rational wager, an initial assumption of intelligibility taken without evidence. Thus, in the exercise of both reason and imagination, we seek meaning in the absence of hard proof that our faculties are trustworthy. The wager to trust reason is doubtless sweetened later by the impressive results of science and technology. But this should not obscure the cold epistemic reality. Despite its pragmatic results, we can never prove that reason is a suitable tool for grasping truth. We can only assume it is, and work from there to see where we end up. This makes it problematic to take the common rationalist position that only science speaks truth. It's problematic among other reasons because the imaginative modes of insight, including the mythic, demonstrate their own different but similarly compelling set of results to those of science. There is profound power to great art, a coherence to reality which cannot be explained away or reduced to a rational explanation. There is also exceptional universality to art. Few cultures across history have been deeply ordered around the rational principles of the sciences, but every culture has produced imaginative interpretations of reality, myths, art, and music. Art is existentially hugely powerful and virtually universal, features which point to some deep degree of coherence between art and the human condition. Admittedly, there is no more proof of the trustworthiness of the imaginative claim to meaning than there is for the rational claim. However, both wagers, once taken, are able to marshal considerable post hoc evidence that they have some insights into reality that are worth taking seriously. What are we to make of this? The philosopher and essayist George Steiner puts the relationship between propositional insights and mythic insights this way. Theories, crucial experiments, algebraic models aim at proof. Proof is, in essence, terminal. But the humblest of myths, on the contrary, is open-ended. Myth offers to our impatient questioning the most vivid perception of the neighbourhood to our everyday experience of the otherness in life and in death. To Steiner, the entire shape and purpose of myths is aimed at a different purpose to that of abstract proofs or demonstrations of science. Myths do not communicate in a way that tries to pin things firmly down. Yet when engaged with on their own terms, it is this exact property which enables myths to operate as they do. It makes them unique contexts for working out deeply human things that are almost impossible to define in objective propositional terms. Because myths show rather than tell, they can make present to us something profound. The otherness, the strangeness, the longing and love, the beauty and tragedy in life and death. Yet, myths vanish like a mirage under the forensic glare of analytic probing. Like a star glimpsed out of the corner of an eye, which vanishes when stared at directly, myths will either be accepted on their own terms or not at all. Attempts to break myths apart, to analyse them by inductive methods, are like an attempt to understand human personality through vivisection. Myths yield their meaning most fully when we dive into them with our imaginative faculties. When we try to study them analytically, they play dead. Their luminosity vanishes. Just as vibrant creatures of the deep sea, revealed in their alien glory from the window of a submersible, become flaccid, dead and grey when hauled up to the cold light of day for inspection, myths only speak their meaning when we enter their world on their terms. Like a poem, a myth is not grasped by dissection, but by dwelling with it, by listening, by speaking it out loud, by imagining it. Whereas a rational proposition is closed, myth, in common with all art, invites you in, to look around, to revel in it, and in so doing, to explore yourself. In a sense, it is because of this subjectivity, and not despite of it, that myths can perform their potent existential functions. Roger Scruton identifies this feature of the mythic as a key function of art in general. Art enables us to dwell among the richly varied colours of the full emotional palette of the lived experience. Grief, hope, joy, fear, love, melancholy, guilt and despair. Yet crucially for Scruton, it enables this encounter without our having to live through all the kinds of situations that might occasion these responses in our own lives. We can explore death without having to die, mourning without actually suffering loss, fear without physical threat. We gain a form of moral education that is nonetheless not moralizing in its tone. Thus poetry, music, visual art and myth have moral significance, but not because they preach to us immoral propositions. This is because they can frame complex moral and existential realities for our imaginative faculties, and not primarily for the rational. Anyone who's used music or art or poetry to help them reflect on their existential condition knows this latent power. The subjective arts help us to contemplate and consider the realities of being in a way that is difficult when we are gripped by our own circumstances of grief, hope, joy, melancholy, guilt or despair. Myth, like art in general, offers a kind of loose moral education, not a sermon but a sandbox for exploring the human condition. There are, for instance, things Homer's Iliad, Picasso's Guernica or Beethoven's Missa Solemnis can teach us about our personhood that the sciences of psychology and neurology cannot touch. Art has a universal appeal, at least in part because it provides a context for working through deeply felt truths of the human condition that are nonetheless almost impossible to define in objective terms. In this sense, the subjective arts allow us to speak things that cannot be spoken in any other way. True enough, science can help us understand and precisely describe the physical world, enabling impressive technological feats, but it is deathly silent on matters of morality, of being, and of purpose. In other words, on what matters most to human beings. There thus seems to be an irreplaceable necessity to the poetic, the mythic, the artistic, as though it pushes through so consistently in culture because it performs functions that no other form can. We apparently cannot simply replace the function of myth with rational propositions. But where does the meaning reside in art, and in the mythic in particular? Reason, with its propositional forms of communication, at least provides a certain clarity to where its meaning is situated. With the mythic, which speaks such a different language, the search for meaning demands a different approach. The subjective nature of the mythic form makes it open to numerous expressions and re-expressions. A defining characteristic of the great mythic themes is their almost endless adaptability. The fictitious characters through which the greatest myths approach us are largely secondary to the meaning they carry within. The actors of the mythic world and the stage on which they play are figments of a particular author's imagination, given shape by the cultural palette of that author's specific context. However, this creative license is subsequent to the real heartbeat of a myth, the universal themes lying beneath the outer clothing of character and of place. This means that in practice we find the characters and context of a myth can be changed without fundamentally changing how the myth operates on the imagination. Myths are often reworked down the ages, yet retain their distinctive power. It's exactly this interchangeable nature of characters and contexts that points so powerfully to a universal significance lying at the heart of the great myths. This deeper seam of meaning fueling the mythic can be taken up and transposed into virtually endless contexts by different authors while maintaining much of the same luminous power and appeal. Different representations of a given mythic theme may vary on the surface, the specifics being functions of a given place and time, but the animating force driving the myth is discernibly conserved. Just as the same light shining through a stained glass window produces dancing colours in many hues, the weight of the human condition and the experience of reality, refracted through different cultures and ages, has produced different mythic tales, different interpretations of the same sensed beam of meaning. As G.K. Chesterton put it, every true artist feels that he is touching transcendental truths, that his images are shadows of things seen through the veil. This kind of artistic exegesis, in other words, this reading out of a form of universal meaning, is a fundamentally poetic process that defies rational categorization. The poet channels significance sensed deep in the human condition, artfully transplanting this living heart into a new body of context and character. Over the ages, the great artists have mined the same mythic themes over and over again, reaching into the human condition and drawing forth handfuls of the same raw existential material, which is then shaped by each artist into a new expression. We find an analogy for this channeling function of myths in the way linguistic signs channel meaning. The actual signs used in language are mostly secondary to the cognitive content of our speech. We can translate a book into the distinct vocabulary and grammar of French, Arabic or Mandarin, whilst barely changing the content. We see that the meaning is deeper than the form used to express it. There is, after all, little intrinsic meaning to words as mere vocabulary. But in the hands of a skillful wordsmith, language channels meaning that can raise armies, break hearts, and make the imagination soar. In the same way, myths use fictitious characters as a kind of channel to express universal themes. In myths, we find a mapping of representations and narratives onto deep streams of coherence and meaning within the human condition. Hence the greatest mythic themes can be transposed into different contexts, cited in different ages, clothed in different characters. And yet in all these different translations, their power and meaning remains undimmed. We recognise the same tang of truth and correspondence to human realities in all of them. Over the centuries, it's been a rite of passage among the truly great poets of each generation to take up this gauntlet of transposing the great myths of antiquity into the key of their own age. This is why the accusation that Shakespeare plagiarised the dramas of Greek antiquity is misplaced. Rather, in a process of profound homage and artistry, the bard breathed the animating spirit of the earlier works into a new home. As George Steiner points out, this reworking of myths is not an analytical process. Narratives and myths are poetic genres. They are not theories. To take another example, Dante did not analytically deconstruct the Aeneid in writing the Divine Comedy, but the luminous presence of the earlier work shines through nonetheless. The poet transposing the great mythic work carries out a profoundly sympathetic process of engaged interaction with the parent text, but it's not one that can be deconstructed to arrive at an algorithmic process. We cannot logically formulate a method to construct or transpose great myths. In fact, the ability to craft myth is generally extinguished by the kind of self-conscious analysis familiar to philosophy and the natural sciences. We cannot explain the enduring existential appeal of Shakespeare's plays by dissecting his choice of words or parsing the phrasing of his stanzas. And crucially, it's unlikely that even Shakespeare himself could explain his play's meaning in such terms. The artist, after all, is not an engineer constructing a text formulaically. Rather, they must descend to the deeps of the imagination and return with empty hands, as it were, to relate what they have seen using only the poetic forms. As Claude Levi-Strauss observed, the practice and the use of mythological thought demand that its properties remain hidden. To Levi-Strauss, the process of trying to craft myths by focusing self-consciously on what myths are would be somewhat like concentrating intensely on the laws of phonetics and grammar while trying to speak. The result is, of course, to lose your thread almost instantly. It's virtually a definition of the subjective or stochastic arts of poetry, music, visual art and myth that the artist channels something of which they are not in full rational control. In other words, myths cannot be theoretically constructed or deconstructed. Reason has a very limited ability to speak into what makes art so potent. But though the almost prophetic ability to craft great mythic works is rare, a sensitivity to mythic themes is a near universal human trait. Humans appear to have an innate responsiveness to mythic expressions, which transcends what is rationally explicable or capable of propositional communication. It seems that we sense things in reality that cannot be named in clear statements. There are aspects of our existential condition that mostly elude objective categories, but are nonetheless among the most powerful forces in the human experience. It is these with which the mythic engages so powerfully. C.S. Lewis was not alone in having a childhood punctuated by vivid sensations of transcendence and longing, experiences that could not be explained away by a rationalistic account. And many people can identify with this. The early years are often a phase of great imaginative susceptibility, a time when it feels as though the veil is thin between the visible world of objects and facts and an unseen world of dreams and apparitions, a world elusive and yet shimmering with meaning and suggestiveness. Though the pragmatic concerns of adulthood dull this sensitivity for most of us, great art is built on exactly this sensitivity to unseen but potent streams of meaning that flow deep beneath the gaze of the rational faculties. Whenever we find the same themes resurfacing again and again in the poetic expressions of human cultures, we should rightly suspect that we've located a coordinate of weighty significance. We are, so to say, on holy ground, imaginatively speaking. And it's exactly these rich deposits of deep coherence to felt experience which myths mine so potently. In this way, we might say that myth is a layer of poetic expression through which deep intuitions of our nature are given voice. Few mythic expressions fully correspond to tangible entities or historical events in their specific details. But whenever we stumble onto a vivid mythical theme, it is likely that something of existential importance is buried not far beneath the ground. The urge to mythologize, so universal across cultures and ages, speaks to the reality of a unique and potent form of meaning. The need and the ability to mythologize appears to be an emergent property of our ontology, something which is inseparable from what human beings are and what their purpose is. There is something of a necessity to the mythic form, as though it owes its enduring nature to its ability to channel and communicate things that no other form can.